To me, remembering that was more disturbing what I remember from the day before than the accident itself, because
This is shuttle launch control at T-minus 50 minutes and counting. Pilot Michael Smith was asked by the orbiter test conductor Roberta Wyrick just a minute or two ago to...
The sun had started to rise on Cape Canaveral. It was launch day. 7 astronauts from all walks of life were being prepared to be sent into space. But the night before, however, had been incredibly cold. Due to a series of issues, this particular launch had been delayed time and time again, and was now taking place in January. The launch teams were going back and forth on whether the vehicle was safe to fly.
Many of our engineers, as well as myself, were concerned about the forecast of the cold temperatures were expected during the launch window.
But eventually the signal to go ahead was given, and the 7 astronauts made the fateful walk across the launch gantry and into the shuttle itself. It would be their last steps on Earth. This launch had a lot more spectacle than usual. On board was Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher who was a part of the Teacher in Space project, a project designed to inspire the next generation of minds in all things space. This also meant that school kids from all across America would be tuning in to watch the launch. It was going to be one of the most viewed launches in a long time. And at 11:38 AM, the shuttle, the external fuel tank, and the 2 solid rocket boosters blasted off from launch pad 32B. And less than 2 minutes later, at T plus 73 seconds, the excitement was over. Stunned silence had filled the void that moments before was filled with happiness and jubilation. The entire rocket had been ripped apart just seconds before engine cut-off, and was now hurtling towards Earth with many of the crew still inside, alive, awaiting their demise when eventually the capsule would smash into the ocean at unsurvivable speeds. But why did the shuttle rip itself apart? What would cause such a horrific accident so deep into a launch sequence? To get the full story, we need to go back a little bit.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
The entire purpose of the Space Shuttle project was to enable reusability, being able to ferry up to 20 tons of material to the space station much quicker than a typical expendable rocket could. Now, when I say reusability, it usually meant a long process of checks. For example, all the tiles on the shuttle's underbelly, which provided the heat shielding upon re-entry, had to be thoroughly checked for damage. There was also a significant amount of checks and rebuilding that had to occur on the boosters. They would usually be contaminated with seawater after each launch. This meant that the shuttle was not exactly at the level of, say, a SpaceX Falcon 9 in terms of reusability, but compared to having to throw everything away and start from the beginning, it was a good step forward in terms of space travel. Having been launched several times since its debut in 1981, the Space Shuttle was seen as the future of space travel. The Space Shuttle had been filled with incidents. An overpressure wave had bent several of the struts on the back of Columbia. Although it did make it back safely to Earth, the damage required a redesign of the water damping system on the launch pad. The shuttle Atlantis also suffered severe damage on takeoff, when the nose insulation from one of the SRBs fell off, resulting in damage to almost 700 heat shielding tiles on the shuttle. Again, it somehow managed to withstand this and make it back safely to Earth. However, with these incidents continuing to stack up, it was only a matter of time before the shuttle's luck would eventually run out, and on the 28th of January, that's exactly what happened. And it wouldn't be the last time either.
Miles downrange, standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
The shuttle's engines by themselves weren't enough to get it into space. It needed the assistance of 2 solid rocket boosters to pull it into orbit. This is where the issue on the final flight of Challenger would arise. Although it might look like it, the boosters weren't actually one continuous rocket. Instead, it was a series of multiple pieces that were eventually locked together into one continuous rocket. This allowed easier manufacturing and also much easier transport. Remember, at this time the boosters, after being found, had to be transported back to NASA so they could be refurbished and checked for any damage. For this transportation to be feasible, the booster, or its pieces, would have to fit on a typical rail car. This meant that segmentation of the booster was the best solution, although be it far from perfect. At launch, these boosters were to burn solid fuel for close to 2 minutes. After this point, they would then break away from the shuttle and fall back to Earth, using a parachute system to break their fall, before eventually being dragged back to land and sent back to be refurbished and put back into use. The main issue of using the Lego block method of assembling the rocket boosters meant that it had a very obvious weak point where each of the sections would be joined together. To solve this very clear issue, a field joint was used. The joint in and of itself isn't of note. The most important thing was the O-rings, the rubber seal that would prevent the hot gas from flowing into the crack between both sections upon ignition, and thus eroding the steel casing from the inside out. In a normal launch, when the SRBs would ignite, the O-rings would create an airtight rubber seal. Basically, the gas emitted from the ignition would push the rubber O-ring tight into place in the gap between the two sections, sealing it closed. This would prevent any gas from getting around the seal and destroying it. But in Challenger's case, this isn't what happened. The O-rings hadn't been tested at very low temperatures before, as cold as -12 on the right SRB on that day. And due to the additional wind shear, it meant that the O-rings on the aft section of the right booster failed to perfectly seal. This can actually be seen on the right aft section upon takeoff, where a plume of black smoke is emitted from the booster as it leaves the launch tower. This allowed a very hot stream of gas to escape along the side of the ring, and when you push any gas or liquid through a smaller area, it tends to both heat up and speed up. The gas in the SRB was no different in this case. This caused the O-ring to basically burn away extremely quickly, and the process of burning through the steel casing to the side of the O-ring to begin, and eventually end the life of the shuttle and all those on board. The thing is though, both NASA and the company that had made the boosters, Morton Thickle, knew about this issue, the low temperatures, and the effects it would have on the integrity of the O-rings themselves. So why did they go for launch?
And frankly, they did that, and I arranged for a teleconference where our engineering people were in contact with the people at Kennedy and also all the NASA engineering people in Huntsville, Alabama, at Marshall Space Flight Center. And they presented their case, and basically the result of that was the Vice President of Engineering of the company recommended to NASA.
T-minus 30 seconds, and we've had a go for auto sequence start. The SRB hydraulic power units.
The evening before the launch, a call was set up between Kennedy Space Centers in both Florida and Arizona, and that of Morton Thickle to discuss the viability of the launch. During this discussion, the NASA SRB project manager, Lawrence Malloy, said that he did not agree with the analysis behind the decision of the Morton engineers not to launch. However, holding strong, both Robert Lund and Joe Kilminster, management of the Space Booster program at Morton Thickle, both recommended not to launch the following day, at least until the temperature would rise above 12 degrees, the lowest temperature that the O-rings had been tested at. However, after a pause in the call for a private discussion between the management of Morton Thickle, they somehow managed to come back with a call to proceed with the launch. This flabbergasted the on-site representative of Morton at the Kennedy Space Center, Alan J. McDonald, who completely refused to sign a recommendation to launch. Frankly, he himself will be much more capable to tell you what happened than I ever will.
I was kind of taken aback by that, being at the Cape, because I didn't hear any rationalization that changed my mind that the original recommendation wasn't correct. So then NASA said, well, we need to have that recommendation in writing, signed by a responsible faculty official. I knew who that responsible faculty official was. It was me. And I made the smartest decision I made in my entire life, is I refused to sign it. As a result of that, my boss had to sign it back in Utah and fax it down to me.
However, despite this, on the morning of the launch, there was still hope that it could be cancelled. Overnight temperatures had been extremely low enough that water had to be continuously ran through the pipes on the launch pad. This had the effect of spray being thrown up on the higher parts of the platform, generating a large amount of ice, which, if it were to fall on launch, could puncture a part of the shuttle, much like the insulation had done on earlier missions of Atlantis. Even McDonald has stated as much when he awoke the morning of the launch.
Well, first of all, I didn't really expect them to launch because when I saw this ice, I thought sure they would cancel and they wouldn't, except feeling that they could just knock enough of it down because some of it they couldn't get off, and because of the debris issue, frankly. And I didn't know at the time that Rockwell really opposed the launch because of their concern of the debris, ice debris issue. So I didn't really think it would happen. But when they decided to resume the count, and I was sitting there with my headset, and I was on the assumption that they had considered everything, including the discussions we had, and decided it was still an acceptable risk.
However, this was the last puzzle piece in order to set the disaster in motion. And when the decision to launch was given, all that was really left to do was to launch. At 11:38 AM, Challenger lifted off. The black plume spawned from the right booster. However, on launch, as the Challenger didn't immediately explode, McDonald breathed a sigh of relief. He had thought that if Challenger could get past the launch tower and didn't immediately explode, it meant that the seal had held and getting to orbit was possible for the vehicle. But 73 seconds after launch, his hopes were dashed when the hot gas eventually had burned through the joint and smashed into the external fuel tank, causing the vehicle to veer off course. This veering had caused the Challenger to be exposed to aerodynamic forces that it was not designed to handle, sadly causing it to break apart into several pieces before falling back to Earth.
We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
There's not much to say about the aftermath. The debris was recovered, investigations were held, and promises were made for this never to happen again. But words are cheap, especially when 7 astronauts are now dead in one of the worst space disasters in history. And it would be comforting to think that something like this would never happen again. But that would be wishful thinking. Because it did. If you enjoyed this video, why not try this one? I can't promise it's going to be more cheerful, but I guess it's worth the risk.
1911 uniform. 2 Shuttle, stay up.